everyone, and welcome back to Everyday Anarchism. This is a long overdue episode on the work of James C. Scott, who, when I first started telling people I was working on anarchism, was the first name that, academics mentioned. He was, I guess, the most famous academic anarchist, although I'll let my guest weigh in on that. My guest today is Luke Kemp, returning to the podcast. And Luke, before we get to Jim Scott, tell us who you are again and tell us about your book that is coming out.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me on again, Graham. It's a point of pride that you actually wanted me to return, so well, despite the Australian accent as well. So I am Luke Kemp. I'm a research affiliate at the University of Cambridge with the Centre for the Study of Existential Risk. I study worst-case catastrophic scenarios, so things like extreme climate change, nuclear war, essentially anything that could potentially cause global catastrophe, even human extinction. But as you can tell, I also have an interest in philosophical anarchism. Well, both anarchism as a philosophy and as a practice. We'll go into that in further detail during the podcast. And I'm currently just finished up a book called Goliath's Curse, a deep history and future of societal collapse, which essentially tries to do a kind of deep historical view of how societies have collapsed in the past, what's that meant, what that has meant for the people on the ground, and provide more of a kind of people's history of collapse.
Yeah, I think we've spoken about this briefly already, but this is, one of the ways that I have found to think about anarchism in terms of doing historical analysis, and I assume this will bring us to something like Against the Grain, is something like when you look back at history, and I talked with Eleanor Janiga about this as well, you tend to look and think about all the great stuff that happened. Like the protagonist in history is like Ramses. Ramses is the protagonist. And it's like, fuck yeah, look at those pyramids. That was awesome. And then, but Ramses was probably basically the Hitler of his time. I'm guessing more or less, and that's not a perspective that we usually apply to the ancient past. Have I roughly got that right? I know you should never mention Hitler. I know that was a mistake, but what's done is done.
I forget the name of the measurement, but there's a measurement of conversations of how quickly get to Hitler.
Yeah,
we definitely did well there.
Yeah, I got us right there. Fine, we can say Mussolini then. Like these people, the great figures of history would probably be considered monsters by our standards, but we kind of tell history through the story of Ramses and Napoleon and Caesar.
Absolutely. The old motto and cliche of history is written by the victors is, of course, true. In the book, I phrase it as a 1% view of history. When you look at historical documentation, very few people could actually write, and those who could write were almost always in the employ of kings, emperors, and the rich. Those who could actually pass on in kind of the material legacy what they were building were, of course, once again, kings, emperors, and the rich. So both in archaeological record as well as in historical documentation, we have a huge skew towards just the 1% of society, basically. Even if you look at, say, for instance, Rome, which is much more urbanized than many other societies in the past, still roughly 95% of the people were living in urban kind of rural living. And we have far less an idea of how they were living compared to, say, for instance, Caesar. And you're right, when you actually look at what most of these emperors were doing in the past, by modern standards, they'd be considered absolutely monstrous. I mean, crucifying thousands of slaves more or less just to send a message to the rest of the populace, that is absolutely draconian. It's mortifying. And yet, that is apparently the golden age of the Roman Empire. Armed men rounding up women and selling them as slavery. That's something you can see in both Rome, but also ISIS. And of course, ISIS today is seen to be just a death cult, in the words of one Australian politician. Rome, on the other hand, is the bedrock of Western civilization. So there's definitely some weird inconsistencies there.
Yeah, excellent. And my understanding is James C. Scott is one of the people who really helped us see in the past, I guess, probably 50 years or so, these inconsistencies. Does that sound right?
Absolutely. I think there were many archaeologists who skirted around this, who have more or less pointed out how bad it was to live under some of the original states. James C. Scott was the first one to actually, I think, tie it all together into one kind of forceful argument about both the original states, but also most states historically. And that was primarily the book Against the Grain. He also kind of covers, to a certain extent, other books such as... I'm actually blanking on it. How am I blanking on his most famous book of all? Seeing Like a State. There we go. Yeah, but I think you see many more archaeologists who, even though they don't technically wear the moniker of anarchism, are pretty close to anarchist thought when they actually look at states of the past.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you say something like looking at history, from the 99% instead of the 1%, you'll probably get a ton of people nodding along to this pretty sensible way of doing history. And then if you mention to them that that's an anarchist slogan that came out of Occupy Wall Street, they might say like, I'm not an anarchist, of course. I just simply think that we should look at democratic grassroots ground up practices and create a more people centered civilization. It's like, well, okay, then we just are back to the old argument we're always having about the word anarchism.
Precisely. I mean, this even comes down to the basic philosophy of anarchism. If you say to people, I believe that we should try to have cooperation in a non-violent way, that hierarchy should only ever be done through explicit consent of all those governed, and that we should take democracy seriously and everyone should have an equal amount of political power. Most people agree. And yet, as soon as you say anarchism, they are absolutely astounded that you would even utter that word. And I think that in many ways actually relates to the 1% view of history. Like, the reason that anarchism is considered a dirty word, an unspeakable word, is because it's been an incredibly successful propaganda campaign to basically say anarchism is the philosophical equivalent of throwing a brick through a window. When clearly it is not.
So an episode that hasn't aired when we are recording, but will air before this episode comes out. I recorded an episode on anarchist terrorism in the age of Luigi Mangione, sort of looking back at what anarchist terrorism looked like. And the outcome of that episode was anarchism didn't mean terrorism, but anarchists were the main terrorists in the world for about a 30-year period. They were not the main terrorists before 1880. They were not the main terrorists after 1910. And yet, that 30 years of anarchist terrorism is just going to be what anarchism is forever, due to, precisely as you say, this propaganda campaign.
Yeah, and of course, terrorism is itself a loaded word as well.
That's true.
Again, something of a piece of state propaganda where violence, when it's done by the state, is totally okay. When it's done against the state, is, of course, an unspeakable act. And when you look at it, in terms of the actual number of people whose lives were lost due to anarchism, vis-a-vis, say, for instance, the Great Leap Forward, or any kind of like state-run campaign of persecution and torture, it just is minuscule by comparison. Yeah.
I think probably the average Tuesday in the world's prisons great outstrips the everyone killed by anarchists between 1880 and 1920. I wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah, there's 30 years. It's much less about the number of people who died and the amount of damage done, and much more about how scared it made people in power, I think.
Yeah, I think that sounds right. And yes, of course, I agree. Terrorism, that's a state thing that, the anarchist, the bad anarchists tried to democratize terror. And I am much more for abolishing terror than democratizing it.
Precisely.
Is there anything we should cover before we get to this book, Two Cheers for Anarchism, that we're here to talk about, from Seeing Like a State or Against the Grain, besides the very vague stuff we've already hit that you want to make sure people know about Scott?
I think it's worthwhile quickly placing Scott into the context of kind of modern day anarchist thinkers. And I think you're right that James C. Scott may be one of the most well-known anarchist thinkers, particularly amongst academics. I think he's probably rivaled to a certain extent by the likes of David Graeber and even to a certain extent Noam Chomsky. I'd say those are kind of the big three right now.
That sounds right, yeah.
Yeah. And it's thinking of that, it's also quite demoralizing and sad that, of course, we've lost two of them quite recently, and Chomsky's not in the best health right now either. But yeah, so I'd say that Scott is or was one of the biggest thinkers, and it's notable that both Graeber and Scott came from an anthropologist background, more or less. In the case of Scott, kind of a mixture of political science and anthropology, but nonetheless. And Scott, what else did I say about him? I mean, There's an entire documentary if you want to understand his background life story. It's available on YouTube, free of charge. And as far as I know, he grew up in a more well-to-do family, kind of middle class, but his father died quite early, and he was exposed to kind of the working classes as well as more marginalized peoples. And I think he grew up on the East Coast around New Haven, if not mistaken. And that seemed to embed into him kind of a class consciousness. And he was then, I think, even further radicalized through anti-war protests, particularly during Vietnam. And his biggest kind of switch here seems to be that he, during his PhD, went to Burma at the time and more or less tried to look at how peasants behaved under different kinds of circumstances. But in particular, he was interested in more or less resistance without active revolt. So how people do things like dragging their feet, little minor subversions of hierarchy and authority in order to kind of have some agency in their own lives. And that resulted in his most famous piece of work, at least initially, called Weapons of the Weak. It's worth just putting it as an aside saying he has an absolute talent for making amazing titles. You know, Weapons of the Weak, Against the Grain, Seeing Like a State. Academics aren't usually quite good at that, but Scott had a certain flair for it. But yeah, I'd say overall, one way to kind of summarize Scott's legacy and his entire purpose is that he attempted to view the world from a peasant's point of view. Whether it be looking at this historically or just looking at a single case study of people in Burma, for instance. He tried to very much think, how do the people with the least amount of power view current social arrangements? How do they experience the world? Rather than, of course, the 1% view, which most academics tend to take.
Yeah, excellent. I also want to mention here, as we're thinking about these other works written by him, that in the New York Times obituary, one thing that was mentioned like multiple times was the question of like whether or not his books were like, quote, real social science. And it's funny because one of the big things in Two Cheers for Anarchism and Seeing Like a State is a critique of a sort of epistemological hierarchy that puts a certain way of thinking, especially numerical thinking, ahead of the actual words and thoughts and feelings of the people living these lives. So that even in his obituary, it was like, sure, I mean, he was a great thinker, but was he an anthropologist? I don't think he was really a political scientist. As if this sort of disciplinary boundary is the stuff that really matters when we're thinking about someone. That just seems like a perversity, honestly.
I think it's notable that in the case of Dave Graeber, Jim Scott, as well as Noam Chomsky, they all had a healthy disrespect for disciplinary boundaries. You know,
yeah.
Chomsky was trained as a linguist.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, that seems to me like right there one of the keys to their anarchism. I mean, if you go one of the most famous books of the 20th century, Foucault's Discipline and Punish, has that joke there. Discipline meaning discipline as in the hitting the child with the rod, but also discipline as in literature or philosophy, and academics are supposed to get hit with the rod metaphorically and not go into other disciplines. And James C. Scott didn't do that, and they tried to hit him with the rod in his own goddamn obituary in the New York Times.
And notably, the rod is often non-metaphorical as well. It's very difficult to get tenure if you're trying to publish or act in an interdisciplinary fashion. But funnily enough, it seems to work the opposite when it comes to most people. You know, the reason that David Graeber, Jim Scott, and Noam Chomsky are well known, their books are pretty well received, is because people like interdisciplinary work. It tends to be often more provocative, and you can get a fuller picture of a problem if you take multidisciplinary lenses rather than just sticking at it from an anthropologist's point of view. But yeah, I think that once again, it is notable that Scott had this problem of, was he really such a scientist? But also this constant debate of, was he an anarchist? And people get far too hung up on that.
Yeah, let's go. I mean, let's go into that now. I mean, one of the questions about this book, like, is it an anarchist book? And yeah, we can tie this right in here with, you know, was he an anarchist? And this is, I don't know. I mean, I was just I can't remember why I was on Reddit. I spend very little time on Reddit. Maybe I shouldn't be embarrassed to have ever been on Reddit, but I am embarrassed that I was on Reddit. And I was in the Reddit anarchism thing, and just like it seems like the game in that subreddit. My apologies if you're a huge anarchism subreddit person listener. As near as I can tell, the game in the anarchism subreddit is banning people who are not anarchist enough. That seems to be the main activity. And I guess this is like a classic anarchist activity. From one respect, and this is the respect I would like, anarchism is it's not even a political philosophy, and should be the most fluid, the most contested, the least ideological political philosophy. But I take the other point of view that like anarchism means smashing every other political ideology. And so if anyone sort of mentions, well, maybe we could have a non-hierarchical form of organization, it's like, oh, you said organization. You're kicked out of the anarchist group. Does that make sense? And this I've seen Scott discussed in these like internet forums. Not like, let's talk about what form his anarchism takes or how he was informed by anarchism, but just yes or no, 1 or 0, is he an anarchist? And I think the internet anarchists, Luke, say that the answer is no.
This reminds me of one of my favorite songs by David Rovics called I'm a Better Anarchist Than You, where he just goes at length about why he's a better anarchist than everyone else. I think that song embodies a particular mentality within the anarchist community, and one that's surprisingly prevalent. And that's for two good reasons, both of which are understandable. I think the first is that anarchism has often developed a bit of a siege mentality. When you are such a maligned idea and movement, naturally you start to close ranks. And secondly is that anarchism is pretty hard to define. I think that people often have pretty conflicting views of what exactly anarchism is. And Scott, I think, is emblematic of that. And that's one of the reasons I actually really like Two Cheers for Anarchism. You can think of anarchism as a set of philosophical thoughts about how to order society. You can think of it as, David Graeber once said, a practice rather than a philosophy. It's something you do rather than something you think about. And Scott had a slightly different view. He, as he discusses in Two Cheers for Anarchism, essentially sees it as a lens for viewing society. It's a way of seeing the world. Rather than thinking about this as one very particular philosophy in which you make a blueprint for the world, or even as necessarily a practice, doing consensus, for instance, he thinks it's a way in which you look at the world around you. And in particular, you start to view things from the basis of power relationships and start to think about what is this like for the people at the bottom.
Yeah, he calls it in this book the anarchist squint, and I must admit I love it. I don't know if he uses the word lens or not, and I'm not going to attack you for using the word lens, but I dislike the use of the word lens because there's something totalizing about a lens. If you put a lens over something, or if you put a lens over your eye, no light will enter your eye except through that lens. And everything, you might think things are very sharp if it's the right kind of lens. But if it's a really sharp and in focus, you're also missing tons of stuff. And in some ways, you've handed over the job of looking to your lens. But if you're squinting, you're still you. You're still there. You haven't handed over your ability to see to an external device. I'm inclined to say something like Marxism is a lens. It sort of demands you see everything in a certain way. And one of the things it demands is that you see small shopkeepers as capitalists and therefore the class enemy. And an anarchist squint lets you notice that, hey, these small shopkeepers seem to be kind of running this community on mutual aid, even though, yes, from a Marxist lens, they're capitalists who are, creating surplus value that they're keeping for themselves. But an anarchist squint is like, oh man, that person who sells, vegetables at the market is actually really kind of the pillar of the community and is someone who I count on and rely on. And that's why I like the squint metaphor so much.
And honestly, that's probably why Scott likes it as well. He does spend a good chunk of the book talking about the need to think about particularities, contingency, rather than taking the totalizing view that often characterizes hierarchy in the state. So, you know what, I'm going to adopt squint as well. You've convinced me.
Yeah, I think seeing like a state is another way to think of, a lens. States don't squint; they use lenses.
Yeah, agreed. And I think actually this is probably my training as academic coming through, is that we're often taught to think about the world in terms of lenses. You know, you apply different disciplinary as well as theoretical lenses to a problem, which in retrospect I don't really quite like. So this has caused me to reflect on some very important things, Graham.
Well, I mean, look, I try not to bring up academia too much on this podcast, but, I had this, I mean, back when I was a grad student, I had a pretty, I mean, this just a professor who was well known for being mean. And she asked me what lens I was using in my work. And I was like, I try and take a sort of sense of Jamesian pragmatism or a Cavelian sense of things as they are. And I don't want to impose a lens. I try and let each literary or cultural work tell me how to read it. And I don't know, she's a Marxist, whatever. I don't know what her ideology is, but she just said, if you don't have a clear lens that you bring to the work, you are nowhere and you will just never be able to see anything clearly. And I mentioned that to all the professors on my committee, and they were all like, oh, yes, what you said is kind of nice, but she's right. You have to have a clear lens. But I don't, it's like, I don't think that's right. I think everything is in conversation with everything else, and you should see how things work and how they fit together and what they do. And if you apply lenses, that's not what's going to happen. But you're right. Lens is like the first academic question, or one of them, is what is your lens?
Yeah. And funnily enough, if you did this in your personal relationships, they'd fall apart pretty quickly. If you tried to just constantly apply a Marxist lens to every romantic relationship you have, I don't think your partner would be too happy with that. It's about having empathy and about having multiple perspectives you can take to a problem. And of course, we can quibble that that's just taking multiple different lenses and then combine them into one kind of kaleidoscope or something like that. But nonetheless, it's important to view things in multiple different kinds of ways. And that's something obviously Scott stresses in this book as well. I think this is both, for me, this is the personal strength of Scott's work. And I think it's what many view as his weakness as well, is that he does view anarchism as being essentially a tool. It's a squint, a way of viewing the world, rather than being any kind of totalizing philosophy. If anything, I think he'd see that as being kind of antithetical to anarchism, as it's a single blueprint or ideology for the world. And I think this causes him in many ways to depart from what many would consider to be kind of traditional anarchist values. In particular, early in the book, he discusses how he thinks states at this stage may be necessary. They have to be democratically constrained, but the state as a centralized coordinating body to ensure both the protection of personal freedoms, equality, and of course just addressing market failures may be necessary. And indeed, he actually argues that it is necessary. He doesn't really go in depth as to why that's the case. But I think there's some really interesting cruxes here in the community that Scott touches upon. One of them is, can we have states in a kind of anarchist world? And the second is it ever just or legitimate to use violence to enforce rules? And I think in both of those, Scott probably departs a little bit from the traditional anarchist viewpoint. But I also think that's completely legitimate. It's more about what kind of arguments can he muster to support those points of views, rather than is he adhering to any kind of particular dogma.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I was speaking to Ruth Kenna about this book, and I can't remember quite what she says, because she's critical about this book in her book, The Government of No One, and she says that she thinks Scott has sort of got the problem the wrong way round when he says sort of like, oh, well, we need states to do these things, because I think she thinks that he's not, he's approaching the problem, backwards. And I think that makes a certain amount of sense. Mm-hmm. But also her ultimate conclusion in that book is we need to anarchize everything. She doesn't advocate for the tearing down of the state and replacing it with an anarcho-utopia. She argues for taking the things that exist and making them more grassroots, more democratic. I don't think you'll see a, a big difference in a world in which we've anarchized things from the world that James Scott is arguing for. And in terms of, does he advocate for violence in terms of hierarchy? I mean, sorry, violence in terms of enforcing rules? I mean, the traditionally anarchists, I know of very, very few anarchists who say there's no room ever for violence under any circumstances. Gandhi and King both say that violence in certain moments of self-protection might be necessary. If your standard is this person absolutely does nothing but try to destroy the state all day in a 100% nonviolent way, there's not a lot of anarchists out there, I think.
Precisely. But I think there's some really interesting kind of fundamental points of tension in anarchism of how people view it. And I think violence is one. I think do we have to have a state is another one. And you can even bring up things like consensus as well. And Scott doesn't touch upon decision-making very much in his work. Obviously, people like Graeber are absolutely gung-ho hardcore about you have to have consensus. But one of the reasons I like Scott's point of view is he brings it back down to anarchism is a way of viewing the world. It's a way of doing politics. And you essentially just kind of work from that basis. From there, it's essentially politics. It's about negotiation, equal terms, rather than imposing a particular decision-making toolkit or vision of the world upon everything else. If anything, he'd be opposed to that because it's more or less, once again, seeing like a state to a certain extent. But I personally have a lot of time for Scott's approach here. And when I'm actually discussing this with people who don't identify as anarchists, they tend to actually be the most receptive to this idea of the anarchist squint rather than anarchism as a particular philosophy.
Yeah, I mean, another way of putting this is that anarchism as a particular philosophy, anarchism as a political philosophy is actually pretty weak. There's not much there. It basically boils down to there cannot be sort of external claims to hierarchy and justice that are outside the political process and cannot ever be challenged. That's really all you can get because, as you say, like when you mentioned earlier, there can be forms of social hierarchy as long as they're based on consent and consensus. Then that means there can be, if that's what anarchism means, then, Thomas Jefferson was an anarchist and maybe John Adams was also. Essentially everyone except for a dictator who claims that there is no right to challenge their government is an anarchist in the political philosophy. Another way of putting it, there's the old joke, that everyone is an atheist for all gods except for one, I think everyone is an anarchist for the vast majority of governments. And usually they only have one or two governments that they don't want to overthrow maximum. And anarchists just take one little teeny tiny step more.
Yeah, that is spot on. And the way I often view anarchism and discuss other people is anarchism is just taking democracy seriously. It's starting from the premise of we have to respect other people's freedoms. We should all have equal power when it comes to any kind of collective endeavor. And then you work from there. And while that's pretty basic, and in many ways that seems almost banal, it's actually a really fundamental and radical way of viewing the world and trying to set up society as well. And one of the bits I like about Scott's book is very early on, he touches upon a really important point, which I think anarchism brings up, which people don't think about enough. And it's summarized in a quote from Bakunin of, what was it? Freedom without socialism is privilege and oppression. Socialism without freedom is brutality and slavery, which I think is pretty spot on. If you look at centralizing power under the state, socialists and communists are often entirely okay with that, even though, of course, that can end pretty horribly. On the other hand, liberals are completely and utterly opposed to centralizing power into the state, but centralizing power into corporations, totally fine.
Yeah.
Anarchism essentially says, no, the problem here is centralizing power is the problem. That can lead to power corrupting. It can lead to a whole bunch of horrible outcomes. And it's much more about trying to tie down any kind of centralization of power with democracy. But yeah, to me, this always comes back down to taking democracy seriously. And I think that's already incredibly powerful. And this is probably why, the book is called Two Cheers rather than Three Cheers for Anarchism, is that Scott thinks this is an incredibly powerful way of viewing the world. It can lead to potentially completely radical reformation of the way we do things. But at the same time, it's actually pretty simplistic and pretty basic.
Yeah, well, that actually gets to why this podcast is, I don't know, 3 or so years old, and I haven't covered this book yet, because I sort of came up with the idea for the podcast and using the word everyday anarchism, really reading Graeber and then all of the classic anarchists. And after I started the podcast, I read some James C. Scott and I read some Colin Ward and discovered that they were both very clearly everyday anarchists and even used that phrase. And I just thought, fuck, I cannot mention these people on my podcast because I stole their idea, but I didn't know I stole their idea because I hadn't read them. And it's quite compatible with Kropotkin and such like everyday anarchism. So I've had sort of these two thinkers hanging over my head as two big everyday anarchists. And I finally did an episode on Colin Ward, and I'm finally doing an episode on Two Cheers for Anarchism. And it is such an everyday anarchist book. It's got all the great stuff. It's got jaywalking in it, and being nice to your neighbors, and how it's really frustrating when you have to take standardized tests in school. And that's the place where everyone is an anarchist, and where it's so clear how anarchism is so relevant to your everyday life.
Absolutely. And this is actually probably a nice segue to start to move into some very particular, as Scott would say, fragments or ideas that he discusses in the book. And one of the ones you just touched upon then, I really love. It's one of my personal favorites in the book. And it's the notion of anarchist calisthenics. That you essentially have to think of rule breaking as a muscle you have to regularly train and flex. If you're used to constantly being in obedience to authority, then suddenly, even if you're living under a really good society and you can trust the authorities, if they ever turn bad, you have to have the power to disobey. And he used the example here of being in Germany. I think that was set roughly during the 1960s, if I'm not mistaken, sometime around then. He was a student, and I think it was in an area near Bonn. I forget the name of the town. And he was setting at a set of traffic lights. And if you've ever been to Germany, this still happens. Everyone stood at the traffic lights when it was red, even though you could see a mile down either side of the road and there was no traffic incoming. And I've had exactly the same experience. I was actually also in Bonn as part of my PhD. And I remember having a very similar experience where I was sitting at a set of traffic lights around about 3 a.m. in the morning. It was red. There's not a single car in sight. And yet everyone was just standing there. Of course, I eventually crossed. But Scott's entire point is, jaywalking and doing little things like that, which harm no one, are actually really important ways to get used to disobeying authority. And that way, when it comes to a really important moment, when there's actually big consequences and something at stake, you're willing to disobey authority. And of course, he makes the obvious connection here to maybe the Germans should have been more used to disobeying authority a few decades earlier.
There, now we've come back to Hitler, so we do, we
always do.
Yeah. No, I thought that was so great. There's a wonderful moment in the book where he talks about some a crazy art collective that's put up the memorial to the unknown defector, or what is that? Yeah. The unknown what do they call deserter thing? Yes, I couldn't go with the word. The unknown deserter, and it actually really struck me when he mentions, how many men weren't killed because someone on the other side deserted and never was in the war. And I did think about this, do I exist on this earth because members of the German army deserted and didn't kill my grandparents. It's possible, right? We owe them everything.
Yep, precisely. And the funny thing is, when this is done historically by someone fighting on behalf of a pretty bad regime, we tend to see it as an act of bravery.
Yeah.
And yet when it's done in their own states, of course, it is an act of absolute cowardice. Yeah, so I think it's a very important point he touches upon there. And it's part of a wider critique he offers of often the most common and powerful ways of trying to disobey authority and act in a kind of anarchist fashion are the ones which are both least visible and kind of least heroic. Dragging your feet is much more common than actually directly disobeying orders at work. Desertion is much more common than actually trying to do a kind of internal coup or revolution. And all these different little weapons of the weak, as he calls them, don't tend to come through so much in the historical record. Of course, we don't write about people working less than they should or knocking off early. And even today, of course, we just talk about just quiet quitting. Or the actual kind of big revolutionary moments are seen to be these ruptures which characterize history. But from Scott's point of view, it's actually the kind of more everyday minor practices which really shape most of history. And of course, are once again much more common.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I assume it's this way in Australia. On Fridays, traffic gets really bad earlier in the day. And the reason that is because everyone is just leaving work. Yeah. And there's just sort of a consensus that, God damn it, on Friday you're not still supposed to be in your job at 4:59. Yeah, and absolutely. That is, no one made a rule about that. Every once in a while, I guess the boss sends an email, but that's just the people decided that they don't have to be at work at 4:59 on a Friday. And gosh, it's glorious. Can you imagine if the people decided the same for Monday through Thursday? I mean, we have the power, and we don't need. Well, I mean, maybe we should have a little campaign about it, but you don't need a campaign. You just need this practice of leaving work a little bit earlier. What's the boss gonna do? Find lawyers to sue you because you're only working 38 and a half hours a week? This is not how things actually work in the world. And I think James C. Scott has a great eye for how things actually work. I spend a lot of time criticizing Marxists precisely for the reason I mentioned earlier. They're so ideological. Mm-hmm. They have such a lens. And one of my favorite stories from the book is he talks about, so basically Stalin and just generally the Soviet Union was an utter failure in most ways, but they did do a great job of creating, machinery. I mean, literally machinery. They were able to make metal stuff. They were able to make tanks. They were able to make plows. The factories worked. And so you can tip your cap to them and say, gosh darn it, they killed 40 million people, but they made those tractors. But Scott has a story, I can't remember if it's from East Germany or the USSR proper, of how actually the factories kind of worked on anarchist principles, and the centralizing bureau was never sending the parts they needed, but they would beg, borrow, and steal and fix the broken machine. So even the USSR's and East Germany's factories worked on anarchist principles, not Marxist principles.
Absolutely. And Scott brings up the point that in most factories, particularly in the kind of late 19th and early 20th century, the two most important roles was the general handyman, so basically someone who didn't have any particular speciality, but they're just good at fixing all the different machines in little ways, making sure they worked, doing a little jerry-rigging to make sure they could get through the day. And the second was, I forget the actual direct term for it, but it was someone who basically kept stockpiles of extra parts and would go and barter them if they had any shortages. And neither of those are particularly what economists would say high-skilled or even really well-defined roles. And yet both of them were absolutely critical to making sure the factory performed and functioned on a day-to-day basis.
I mean, I think we can go further, Luke, and say that economists would be surprised to learn that those roles existed in a factory. And if you hired a management consultant to improve your factory, they would probably fire those two people right away.
Absolutely. And the funny thing is, when most of us think about our workplaces, we usually have someone like that.
Yeah.
At my own center, we could have changed the director multiple times, and we did. But we had one admin person who was just a linchpin. If they were lost, the entire institution would have been in big trouble. Yet she was probably one of the lowest paid people in the entire institution. I also know a friend of mine who, it seems like most of her job, and this actually goes for a lot of women's society, is just interpretive labor. Just
Yeah.
simply making sure everyone's getting along, trying to make sure that communication is clear, helping be the diplomat in most cases. If she wasn't there, the workplace goes into war zone really quickly. She doesn't get paid for that, but it's absolutely critical to making sure things function. And Scott also talks about this in a broader sense when he talks about the idea of a strike to the strike to rule, which is basically when you go on strike by simply following all the regulations to a T. And taxi drivers in France do this particularly well. Once you start doing that, once you actually follow all the rules and regulations in the most precise way possible, suddenly things just don't work. The working and functioning of workplace actually depends upon little rules of thumbs, little heuristics, and often a lot of rule breaking as well.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. You can't do it by the rules. And there's a double standard that they will. I mean, as I learned at a workplace, they will punish you for breaking the rules that you have been breaking all along, and everyone is breaking. And in fact, breaking the rules are integral to doing your job. But when they decide they want to get you in trouble, they'll punish you. And you can even say, like, "What? I did this in front of you and asked you if it was okay 6 months ago," and they'll just pretend that thing 6 months ago didn't happen.
Absolutely. But a key point that unites all of this is, once again, their acts of either defiance or just simply kind of simple functioning that society requires, more or less. And they more or less try to both help the functioning of society, but also avoid direct confrontation with the state. And one of Scott's key points here is, of course, we can expect most acts of everyday anarchism to be fairly invisible because people don't want to challenge a state when one of its defining characteristics is it's essentially a centralization of violence. Why go and squat on a piece of royal land when you can just occasionally poach there? You can get off without the penalties, but still get many of the actual benefits. And similarly, why would you bother trying to break into a cinema when you can just simply pirate something at home? And most of us still do this. People do pirating and torrenting all the time, rather than once again trying to break into a cinema or steal movies.
Yeah, I mean, this is a big topic. I mean, so I'm working on video games now, and there's just so many video games that you simply can't play these days. Older video games, unless you pirate them, and the companies don't give you. They don't even have the option to give the companies money to play the video games. If you want the game, you have to pirate them, and the video game industry, and certainly the video game studies field, requires pirating, which is an insane state of affairs. But Scott would have seen it. All right, we've been talking for a while. We don't need to be done, but we should be heading towards the end. Is there anything else you want to hit before we go?
Ooh, I think we should probably briefly touch upon some of the other key fragments. I think a key one here is, if the anarchist squint is essentially the basis of anarchism, Scott sees its opposite as seeing like a state. And he talks about this quite a lot in the second fragment, that states are all about providing order, structure, often quantitative order, and a kind of totalizing view upon things. And he has a whole bunch of different examples here. People, for instance, didn't really have surnames for most of human history. It's largely.
I love that. I loved learning that. The reason, it's so weird when you watch like Icelandic, the Icelandic soccer team play, and all their name is just their dad's name with an ick at the end of it, and it's like, how can they have a society like that? But in fact, that's how basically every society ran for all of human history until recently.
Precisely. And this doesn't just go for surnames, it also goes for even things like measurements. If you were living in Finland as one of the Sami people 300, 400 years ago, even today, actually, I still use the measurement. If you're trying to measure distances, they often do it, I forget the term, but it's a measurement based upon how many pisses it takes for a reindeer. How often does a reindeer need to pee? Which then makes total sense. It's something they're used to. It's a kind of measurement that all of them know quite well. but it's not really easily quantified and used for an Excel spreadsheet or anything like that. But this was the bread and butter of how people actually viewed and operated within the world. They used contextual measurements, naming rituals, etc., which made sense to them and worked for the local context. And states, and I don't think it's just states, but hierarchies in general, tend to do the opposite. They try to actually break things down to very clearly quantified, measurable units that can operate across all contexts. And I think it's interesting that in many ways, this is the polar opposite of the anarchist squint. And Scott doesn't go too much into depth for this, but it is really interesting that the entire point of anarchism, if it's a way of viewing the world, is completely in tension with the way that hierarchies tend to view the world.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And nowhere is this desire to standardize the unstandardizable stronger than in the education system, whatever you want to call it, the educational industrial complex. And Scott is great on this. The first time there was an extensive discussion of Scott's work, or I mean, I guess not extensive, but any discussion at all, was when Teen Nguyen came on the podcast, and he's thinking about games, and noticing that grading is essentially a game. It's about getting a certain number, and then it's about sorting. We can call them students or people or widgets or whatever you want to call them based on their numbers. And it's very easy if you're in the classroom with students to talk them through grades and have them say, yeah, when you think about it, grades seem like they're really useful for employers. They seem really useful for graduate schools. I understand why giant systems want grades, but they don't seem to really help at all me, the student, you, the professor, or the learning process. And then I say, yes, that's exactly right. So what does that tell you about education? And they're like, it's not about learning. It's about sorting and controlling people. And then I say, well, you said it, not me. But it's, it's so obvious, and it's right there in Scott's book, just beautifully laid out.
Precisely, yeah. This is the sixth fragment in Scott's book, where he talks about the problems of quantification and metrics, particularly in academia. If you start to measure things by citation, it's very easy to get lots of citations with articles which either have falsified data or just aren't very good and actually get upended 2 or 3 years later. And of course, citations in, say, computer science are much, much bigger than citations in philosophy or feminist theory or anything like that. It doesn't tell you much about the quality of the work. And I think a really key thing that Scott points out here is not only metrics and quantification often used as a way of sorting and controlling the system, but more importantly, they move politics and power out of the visible. And the key point here is that suddenly you're no longer debating what's important or what we should be valuing. That's more or less smuggled into the background parameters of what you're measuring. So suddenly it's not an interesting question of what do we want academics to actually do in society and what do we value them for. It's suddenly just, we want them to use citations. And there's obviously a whole bunch of background assumptions smuggled into that, which you can no longer debate, you can no longer negotiate. And I think this is something interesting which hierarchies do really well, is they start to take certain things out of the realm of visible negotiation and discussion and place other ones in there. And this is kind of what quantification does really effectively. And it's something which Scott, I think, points out, which often people don't think about so much. And the other thing which I think Scott does well here is he doesn't just simply say we should never use quantificational metrics. Unfortunately, it's hidden in a footnote actually in the book, but he basically talks about when we ever try to do any kind of metric or quantification, we should always ask, how can this be gamed? What are the kind of perverse potential side effects or consequences? What kind of discussions, power plays, or arrangements, values is it smuggling in or putting off to the side? And last but not least, is there a way of doing this which doesn't require quantificational metrics? And again, this is, I think, where Scott is probably maligned by a lot of anarchists and why he speaks of anarchy as 2 cheers rather than 3 cheers. He doesn't take a really strong kind of divisive line here. He's like, well, look, metrics can be important sometimes. They can be really useful, but they shouldn't be the go-to. And we have to be aware that they have downsides. And, he views the state in a very similar way as well. That states can be useful in a whole bunch of ways, but they could clearly have some really bad failure modes. And it's much more about understanding how to tame these things rather than getting rid of them entirely necessarily. I think that's an important one, but the other fragment we should touch upon here is one which I think you're particularly interested in, the petty bourgeoisie. So actually, I want to hear your thoughts on this first. So what do you think of the petty bourgeoisie and Scott's defense
Yeah.
of them?
So for those of you who don't know, and I could totally understand you not knowing who the petty bourgeoisie are if you are not, up on your Marxist theory, because this is really a like 150-year-old claim about a certain quote class in society. If you accept that there are classes in society, which there's ways that I think it's very useful to squint and see classes, and there's other ways that it's not so useful to see classes. But if you're using the Marxist lens, you will see classes. The petty bourgeoisie, small bourgeoisie, or I would translate it as small owner,
Yeah.
is someone who owns something that they use to make their livelihood. Um, if it's a farm, they're a freeholder or yeoman farmer. And if it's a small business, they are a petty bourgeoisie, a small owner. So if you have a mechanic who owns a, 2-car garage, that mechanic is a petty bourgeoisie. If you have someone who owns a corner grocery store, that is a petty bourgeoisie. The local tailor, if you can imagine, in some past 19th century idyllic time when you could have clothes made for you by someone who lived near you, or take clothes to a neighbor and have them mended at a storefront. These are the petty bourgeoisie. And we are supposed to hate them according to Marxist theory, because although they are small owners, they are owners, and owners are bad as a class and must be destroyed in the revolution. And in his little fragment, Scott points out that a society run by small owners, which has, more or less existed in certain times and places. There's never been any society fully run by small owners, but there have been societies that are more run by small owners than any other. These societies would be the closest to a sort of grassroots anarchist utopia that has ever been created. A petty bourgeoisie society is not an anarchist utopia, but compared to every other alternative, feudal serfdom, chattel slavery, the industrial organization of labor, of immigrant labor, a petty bourgeoisie society seems pretty goddamn good. And the reason why it's so important is that the biggest left-wing lens out there, Marxism, simply cannot see it this way. And for them, yes, the local grocer is probably better than Elon Musk, but in some fundamental way, the person who owns the grocery store in your neighborhood, which I know this is a fantasy. I know the neighborhood grocery store is now owned by some giant corporate conglomerate. But if there were a local grocery store anymore in your neighborhood, the owner would be in some fundamental way your enemy, in the same way that Elon Musk is your enemy, when in fact the owner of the local grocery store is your friend, neighbor, and ally in every way except for the Marxist ideology. How'd I do?
Pretty damn well. Yeah, I think that Scott really touched upon this as both. This is a way of protecting agency. Having some small amount of capital, whether it's a parcel of land or a small business, is a way of ensuring that you can more or less determine your own work hours. You can determine how you operate things. It's a way of taking back a small amount of power and agency and autonomy in life. And when everyone can do that to some extent, it's actually not a bad basis for a society. And I think you're touching on something really important here, which is Scott is very practical in the way he views things. He doesn't want to start with like a blueprint of we can have a beautiful world of our property and everything will be perfect, and ergo anyone who owns property is horrible. He views it much more as, well, historically, as you mentioned, a whole bunch of people who have a small amount of property is a much better way of running things than feudalism. And that's happened a lot more frequently than anarchist utopia has.
Yeah.
And apart from that, I mean, there's one small critique I'd offer here is Scott does touch upon one version of kind of petty bourgeoisie we have, which is increasingly prevalent in the world, which is startups. Startups
Yeah.
are similar insofar as people can determine their own work hours. They get to determine more or less the kind of purpose of what they're doing as well. But ultimately, one of the key points of startups is either to become a giant, a Goliath, or to get eaten by one. And unless you have a way of making sure that petty bourgeoisie do not become uber bourgeoisie, then unfortunately that's probably going to end badly in the end. I think this really touches upon an important point here, which once again links back to something Scott discussed at the start of the book, which is you can't have freedom without a certain equality of power. And the beauty of the petty bourgeoisie is that everyone has a small amount of capital, basically, and no one can kind of dominate someone else. Once that starts to shift, then things start to go awry. And I think it would be interesting to hear more from Scott of how do you make sure the petty bourgeoisie do not become larger uber bourgeoisie. Apart from that, I think he does bring up some other really interesting points, like these smaller kind of shop owners, for instance, they perform really important social functions. He brings up the example of the parents of an old friend of his in Germany who their social contact was just going for a walk most mornings, and they mainly just talk to people in small shops, more or less, to the shopkeepers. And the shopkeepers weren't just acting as shopkeepers; they were acting as kind of therapists, psychologists, and just company for the people around them. And once again, this comes back to the idea of often the world doesn't function unless you have pretty basic forms of everyday anarchism, whether it's quiet quitting or petty bourgeoisie.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. And this question of whether a small owner is an owner, I think you're absolutely right. I think it's silly to think of the small owner as an owner. It is true that capitalism sort of demands that every small owner be trying to become a big owner. And in that sense, it does seem like a petty bourgeoisie regime is just a grand bourgeoisie regime waiting to happen. But again, Scott's not trying to solve this with a coherent political philosophy where he explains the precise Keynesian mechanisms by which he would prevent the petty bourgeoisie from becoming uber bourgeoisie. I do also want to mention that the person who is, sometimes called the founder of anarchism, Proudhon, has been slammed, attacked, and thrown out of anarchism since anarchism got going for defending property, even though he's the one who said property is theft. And how do you square this? And the way you square this is he did believe in the petty bourgeoisie, and that makes him not an anarchist according to many, if not most, anarchists. But I think James C. Scott would understand why. Proudhon says if you have a little bit of property, neither the state nor the big property holders can control you. And so the left-wing thinkers of the late 19th century read this and they think, oh, goddamn, Proudhon's a capitalist. He doesn't belong in our movement. But if you read him with a James Scott squint, it makes perfect sense.
Yeah, precisely. And it's worth noting here that pretty much every society has some basic ideas of ownership. Even the most egalitarian mobile hunter-gatherers, they still usually have ownership norms around really basic things like bows and arrows, for instance. It's not that everything is completely and utterly collectively owned. That's true even of the Kung, the Hadza, etc. I think that Scott makes an important point here, but the weakness is once again, and this maybe is both a weakness and a strength, is that he doesn't try to offer clear solutions of, how do you ensure that the petty bourgeoisie don't scale up? How do you ensure that the startup doesn't become Google? Or importantly, isn't just simply fodder and food for Google? He doesn't really try to offer really clear solutions here. Maybe that's the point, that anarchism isn't about providing definitive, direct solutions, but providing a framework for negotiation to reach those solutions depending upon the context. But it's something I would have liked to hear more from him is how do you ensure the petty bourgeoisie don't become worse? How do you ensure that you can take the fruits of quantification and top-down view without falling into seeing like a hierarchy? How do you have those little acts of everyday resistance without them having become a pressure valve, which prevents you from actually doing direct confrontation or revolution. I think those are little things I would have liked to hear more from Scott. But to me, that's also the beauty of his work. He doesn't try to be the final voice, and I think he'd actually view that as antithetical to anarchism.
I mean, yeah, I agree. The fact that he has written it this way, I think, is actually quite anarchist, and I respect that as well.
Absolutely. I think even the fact he writes this as a set of fragments rather than one coherent monologue or monolithic text is once again kind of his nod to anarchism.
Okay, I agree. All right, I have only two more things to say. The first, this is going to seem unrelated, but anyone who listens is going to be happy. There's a film, a documentary film called Daguerreotypes by the filmmaker Agnes Varda, who, for my money, is the greatest filmmaker of all time. And it was something like, I think she was like nursing her daughter or something like that. And so she could only film as far as the extension cable could connect to the camera. So she just filmed all of the shop owners of her Parisian street. I think this is in the 1960s. The street is called Rue Daguerre, hence daguerreotypes, and there's a pun. And so it's just, you will see what it was like to live in the height of the 30 glorious years in a petty bourgeoisie society. And it really does seem like the most humane and charming form of existence one can imagine. So check out Daguerreotypes by Agnes Varda. I'll put a link to it, and check out also everything by Agnes Varda, because she, I mean, a great filmmaker, the greatest filmmaker. Definitely, I doubt she ever espoused anarchism. Actually, I wouldn't be shocked if she did espouse anarchism, and she was friends with Chris Marker, who, if that guy didn't espouse anarchism, he was pretty fucking anarchist. The last thing to say is, Luke, are you going to come back on the show when the book comes out?
Absolutely. It'll be coming out on July 3rd in the UK and July 16th in the US, so I'll definitely come back before then. And apart from that, one thing I should briefly mention is both highly recommend the book, since we are talking about it. I think if you aren't going to do the hard slog of reading through Weapons of the Week, which is like 600 pages, Seeing Like a State, which is 400 pages, and Against the Grain, which is roughly 400 pages as well, then Two Cheers for Anarchism is a really nice distillation and summary of Scott's work. You know, for me, the first fragment is pretty much Weapons of the Week. The second fragment is more or less a summary of Seeing Like a State. So I'd highly recommend it as just simply an introduction to Scott's work. And apart from that, if you're interested in who he was as a person, as well as his life story, then there's a really good documentary called In a Field of His Own. Once again, you can access it on YouTube. And that's an hour and a half.
In a field of his own. That's another discipline and punish joke, as well exactly, as the Against the Grain joke. So,
yep. But I would also like as something of a compliment of sorts. I think Scott would have seen it as a compliment as well. That,
I agree.
He's happy to be in a field on his own because that's the point. He's not going to be tied down by any particular discipline or expectation. But yeah, I'll definitely be back, and I'm looking forward to chatting to you once again.
Wonderful. And I would say, I would go even further. Seems to me that Two Cheers for Anarchism is a decent enough intro to anarchism. If you are an anarcho curious, that's one of the places that you could start.
I'd agree. When I have friends who are interested in anarchism, I usually direct them exactly towards that.
Yeah, I think so. All right, Luke, thank you so much.
Thank you, Graham.